Welcome back to the program, everybody. This is another Conversations on Anarres. I'm your host, Joseph Orozco, the co-director of the Anarres Projects for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations and initiatives that try to envision a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. And one of our projects is this Conversations on Anarres podcast, in which we talk with scholars, activists, and artists about the work that they're doing that try to envision the kinds of futures that we investigate here on the Anarres project. On this episode, we are doing something that's very exciting to me. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of Ursula K. Le Guin's classic novel, The Dispossessed. The Dispossessed, of course, gives us our name as the Anarres Project, but it was her attempt to try to envision what an anarchist utopia might look like and the complications involved in living on a day-to-day basis anarchist politics. My guest today to have this conversation is someone who has been a longtime admirer of Ursula K. Le Guin and is a political philosopher who is trying currently in her work to envision what Ursula's lessons might be for thinking about our social, political, economic crises in the world today. My guest is Dr. Alexis Shotwell. She is professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University in Ontario, Canada. She has a cross appointment in the Feminist Institute of Social Transformation and the Department of Philosophy there at Carleton. Her academic work addresses questions of impurity, environmental justice, racial formation, disability, sexuality, gender, political transformation. Her own political work and activist work focuses on queer liberation, Indigenous solidarity, and feminist community education. She is the author of Knowing Otherwise, Race, Gender, and Implicit Understanding in 2011, and Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times from 2016. My guest today is Dr. Alexis Shotwell. Alexis, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I had tried to think about who would be an effective guest and conversation partner for this celebration. And I had heard for a while now, a few months, almost a year more, that you had been working on trying to distill some philosophical lessons from the Dispossessed. And so I thought that this would be a great conversation. I'm an admirer of your work in other ways, philosophically speaking. So I thought that I could learn a lot from this, and it would be a great honor to Ursula to be able to speak with you about this stuff. So, but before we get started talking about the Dispossessed itself, I wanted to ask you some questions about your own sort of interests. And particularly, right, what makes you interested in science fiction or speculative fiction more broadly? Um, how did you become a fan of this kind of literature? And what kinds of examples of speculative fiction are you drawn to, either in literature, movies, television, pop culture in general? Why are you interested in this particular kind of form of literature?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think I have lots of answers now about what science fiction is doing. But one of the things that's so interesting about answering this question now is that science fiction has a completely different meaning than it did when I started reading it. And so this is partially like I am the same age as the book, The Dispossessed. I'm turning 50 this year. And when I was growing up, my family ran a used bookstore and a cafe. So I had just a kind of um, dreamy uh, availability of sort of every kind of book, really. Like this kind of anything was there. But as a kid and as a teenager who was book obsessed, I definitely was right away a science fiction and fantasy nerd from very young. And at the time, that was not at all a cool thing to be. Um, so, uh, so I think like when I think back to what science fiction meant to me and what being a fan of science fiction meant to me, a lot of it was this thing that I think it still means to people, which is what does it mean to feel yourself not to be easily part of this world, right? Like what is it to be in relation to the world and to feel that it is strange and that there are things that should be otherwise, and to find literature where people are imagining beyond the world as it is and into the world as it could be otherwise. And of course, so often in science fiction, that is not liberatory, right? So often science fiction returns us to things that are um, just recapitulations of the current mode. And, so many of the things that I read when I was growing up, I go back now in some of my science fiction communities, we call this phenomena that things have been visited by the suck fairy. So things that were really important and liberatory and generative now feel like awful. And so for me, like early people like Marion Zimmer Bradley was really important to me. And I didn't learn until actually very recently that she sexually abused her daughter and participated actively in protecting her husband from any retribution or coming to responsibility of his multiple sexual abuse of young people in fandom. Um, Robert Heinlein was really important to me. I think that, many of his books about um, what I think maybe he would have thought of as free love were really central to my lifelong polyamory. And now I look back at them and I feel like they are so troubling in so many ways. So, quite a lot of the science fiction and fantasy that shaped me, I now think was really fucked up. Um, and then other things continue to inspire and shape me that were, so I was reading also Octavia Butler as a teenager. Um, so I feel like I've been in that, you know, from when there was not very much. And one of the great joys of being alive right now is the incredible beauty and proliferation that was nascent, already present in science fiction in many of its early iterations, but it's just come out so much now. And it's so much more wonderful and sort of whole being to be a science fiction fan now than it was in the 80s and 90s in a certain way.
So many new voices,
Yeah.
particularly right, that we had never seen before, and different kinds of futurisms that make this kind of literature very exciting to sort of think about, especially those that do take the opportunity to disengage us from the world and get us to imaginatively conceive of things that are very, very different from realistic sort of fiction depictions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, this makes me come to my next question for you, because we've talked with many different people about science fiction before, and this kind of question about like the visitation by the suck fairy. I like this metaphor. This was something that many people have said that they appreciated about Le Guin's work, was that uh, she was often self-reflective about her own limitations in earlier iterations of her work, and tried to actively engage it, so that even though some people might not find all of her answers satisfactory, she was taking seriously the question that some of the ways in which she did world building sort of reiterated, or simply just uh, um, put forward these kinds of regressive uh, social configurations or ideas about how people should be, that people found objectionable, and that she was willing to consider how her own work was not being responsive to those kinds of concerns.
Yeah.
So, so this leads me to the question then: how did you find Ursula's work, and how did you decide to become a fan of Le Guin's fiction?
Yeah. So this also is like sort of sands of time. I feel like I can't remember a time that I was reading science fiction and not reading Ursula K. Le Guin, and I don't remember the first time that I read The Dispossessed. I've yeah, one of my friends in grad school who was a really serious science fiction scholar, Shaw Lebert, um, very like in our first year of our PhD program, had a party where he invited people to come over and he gave away science fiction. And his only criteria was that it be something that you hadn't read yet. And and I was really sad because I wanted to take one of the Ursula Le Guin books, but I'd read them all already, so that was not allowed. um, but I would say that started this iteration of thinking about or thinking with Ursula K. Le Guin 8 years ago. I have a friend, Angus McGuire, who is a really wonderful organic intellectual. And we just were talking about liking her work. My partner and I had driven through and visited with Angus. And we started this book group of two where we decided to just read it all, to just read all of the fiction. And we did that, meeting kind of every other week and just talking about it. And Angus is someone who is he's a serious, a serious anarchist, someone who really is a total nerd. Um, and and it was such a beautiful experience to do this, and really also just incredibly lovely because for him, he had read the first 3 volumes of Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea series, which for many years was put out just as a trilogy. And in a process that, just exactly as you describe, Le Guin went back and recognized that in those first 3 books of Earthsea, she was doing really such interesting things about our fear of death and the way that our fear of death produces orientation toward hierarchies. I have a friend and colleague, James Rowe, who's just recently written this book about basically the fear of death, existential fear of death, as a key plank in what he calls supremacy cultures. Um, and I really think, Earthsea is doing this very beautifully. So Angus had read the first 3 books of Earthsea over and over and over again. And we got through our reading of it, and we read The Farthest Shore, which is the third one. And he said, okay, now that we're done with the Earthsea books, what should we do next? And I said, Angus, did you not know that there are 3 more Earthsea books? And it was this he has a boat that's named after the boat in, in the Earthsea books, the Look For. And it was this, so getting to see him go through exactly this experience of what happens if you shift from a series of books that are centered on a guy protagonist, although a not white guy protagonist, but to actually thinking about gender and women. And so Le Guin's self-critique, yeah, she wrote that in really consistently. So that was the beginning of this, of starting to think about this, um, think with Le Guin in this more serious way. And I've kind of been doing it since, and then intensifying it over the last 2 years.
Yeah, shout out to Angus. We know him here
I bet.
in
He's in your
in
neck of the woods, yeah.
yeah, in Oregon, and particularly at the university that Tony Vogt, my fellow co-director, and we both have known and worked with Angus on many different projects, and always appreciate his insights. I think also there was I think my own sort of introduction to Le Guin comes through an Angus kind of relationship, sort of. I'm not sure if they actually know each other, but in a similar milieu, Christian Matthias.
Ah,
He, I believe, was probably one of the first people to give me a copy of the Dispossessed when they finished up his work here at OSU as a graduate student. Gave me a copy of this and said, I think you need to read this." And then through the work with Tony Vogt, have come much more appreciated. And so when we were thinking about building this project, the Anarres project, we had thought about many different kinds of iterations of how this would work. And Tony Vogt said, we really should honor Ursula's imaginative powers somehow in thinking, because it was so formative to both of our sort of ways of thinking about the world and activism. So I like these kinds of genealogies
yeah.
of interest. So thinking about this, so we've established that you're a sci-fi nerd and you have
Mm.
deep nerd credentials, street credentials, and nerddom. I want to talk about your activism and your political work, right? Your political sort of horizon. Um, so similar, how did you become interested in anarchism, particularly as a political outlook?
Yeah.
And of anarchism, what attracts you to this orientation? And are there particular flavors, authors, tendencies within anarchism that you find persuasive or that your own work channels into?
Mm. Yeah, so for me, I think two roots. One was a really sort of formative friend in high school and in my first years, sort of after Antoni Wysotsky, who was an anarchist and an activist, who went from Nova Scotia to the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999, and was really uh, just opened a lot for me politically. And I got to know Antoni through doing community radio, college radio in Canada. Um, and so thinking about anarchism in a theoretical way. And when I landed in Santa Cruz, where I did my grad program, I thought, oh, I could get involved with the community radio station, or I could get involved with the pirate radio station, Free Radio Santa Cruz, which was populated by mostly anarchists. And so I got involved with Free Radio Santa Cruz. And kind of through that, and then through starting to date anarchists, and then thinking about things, sort of unfolded. And I think I would say 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, I would have said that the roots of my interests in and commitments to anarchism came out of my um, upbringing in Buddhism, which I'm currently on break from being a Buddhist. But at the time, I was really invested in and compelled by the idea that people are not fundamentally bad, which is very central to Buddhism. In fact, the idea that in many strands of Buddhism that people are fundamentally good. Um, and so this continues to be something that I think with a lot. So in that mode, right? So the idea of human nature is fundamentally not reliant on or requiring fixed hierarchies, because if we opened a space in which people were not subjected to horrific privation and mutilation, when we have created any spaces like that, people do share with each other, even when people are subjected to horrific privation and mutilation and trauma. They help each other. It's so classical anarchist work from people like Emma Goldman and Berkman and right all assert that. And I would say over the last 10 years, um, I hold a lot of that, right? Like I don't believe that humans are fundamentally bad. Um, I've been kind of more recently reading debates between Peter Kropotkin, who of course is really sort of central to this idea that when beings are alive, one of the things that we're organically doing is helping one another, that we participate in mutual aid. Um, and I've been interested in these debates that I didn't know about between Malatesta and Kropotkin about the question of human nature. And so I am still in formation as an anarchist thinker for myself. And one of the places where I feel I'm in motion is I'm curious about, my understanding is that what Malatesta thought was that there isn't any particular nature. What there is choosing. And that's so there's nothing in particular that we are doing. And I think one of the reasons that I've become so compelled by and convinced by Le Guin is she is definitely in the lineage of Kropotkin and Goodman and Goldman. Uh, and I think that she is forwarding this understanding of anarchism. So it's still anarchist communism, but it's an anarchist communism that is without allegiance to a narrative about human nature, and that is profoundly, I think, um, convinced of a kind of existential freedom of uh, taking responsibility for the choices that we can make and opening more space for other people to be able to make different kinds of choices. So lately, I think of myself as an Odonian, which is Le Guin's form of anarchism.
Yeah, I want to investigate a little bit about what you're calling Odonian anarchism in just a second. But um, so, given your sort of the kinds of questions that have motivated your interest in anarchism in general, around these kinds of questions about existentialist choice or uh, whether there's a foundational human nature, um, you're grappling with these kinds of questions. What drew you to become interested in this kind of deep study, scholarly investigation of Le Guin's anarchism in particular? Like you're trying to figure out these kinds of questions coming from a variety of different sources, and with your recent projects, you've decided to turn to Le Guin for answers. Like, what motivated that sort of move for you to see her as a source of anarchist thought to inspire your work? Like, why do we need to listen to Le Guin at this time to try to sort of think about the importance of anarchism?
Yeah. So part of this is just personal for me, but of course the personal is always present. So I was a really serious practitioner of Buddhism. Uh, Revelations of abuse in my spiritual community came out, and I began to have this really profound inability to um, practice in my community the thing that it turned out had been the founding meaning making engine of my life. And this was so humbling because I always thought that I was really a kind person who was really interested in helping others and so on. And it turned out that once the sort of rug was pulled out from under me, it became clear to me that like I'd had a lot of judgment about like professional colleagues who took all of their meaning from their profile as academics. Um, and I'd sort of been really judgy of people in activist circles. So I've been part of a really wonderful anarchist collective for the last 10 years, Punch Up Collective. And I'd sort of looked around and felt like um, activists need to do more work on themselves. They're getting, too invested in their own, you know, puffing themselves up shtick with their activist work. And it turned out I had those views just because I had this completely other resource for making meaning, which was that all of the things I was doing in my professional life, all of the things that I was doing in my activist life were expressions of my Buddhist vows. And when I became unable to access those, I didn't know how to make meaning. So the very personal part of it is just because I'm a science fiction nerd and I was reading, Ursula Le Guin with Angus, I was like, she is someone who articulates a way to be when there is no received way to be. Like she is someone who in her work offers models for how to go on when things are impossible and you don't see a way to go on. Um, so for people that are not having a profound spiritual crisis, but who are having a profound meaning crisis, which I think is almost everyone, I really think that Le Guin's anarchism in particular offers us something for that space of um, when we recognize or believe that there isn't some plan laid out for us or someone who's going to take our hand and decide how to make this world a better place, but that's something that we are going to do ourselves with others, right? In horizontal relations. I found her just incredibly helpful for this moment.
I have two questions to ask you. One, just as a follow up of this thinking, uh, and another about your sort of reception of Le Guin based on what you've said. So the first question is this. I think that you're right that this is a moment in which many people have these kinds of crises of meaning. There are crises of legitimacy going on in the world, trying people not feeling that there's anything that they can sort of latch onto, and that any sources of authority or leadership that they had once believed in have the ground has come out from underneath them. The future looks very grim, particularly for young people, from the standpoint of youth, and so people are sort of trying to figure out how to move ahead in some ways. A lot of so I've been sort of noticing this stuff in a lot of my own kind of work, and I've been really curious and looking at political thinkers who were writing at moments in which it seemed as though the political horizons that they lived in were collapsing. So I was thinking particularly like of Emma Goldman, right at the end of her life, right before, she's been exiled, and it looks like the world is moving towards fascism. I'm thinking of Gramsci too, in prison, right, and fascists are taking over, and he's wondering like what happened to the revolution, and yet the hope that they maintained and they held on to in the midst of seeing that all the projects that they had worked on one hand seemed to be falling apart, and that the world around them was moving in an orientation that was totally contrary to any kinds of hopes that they had ever had for human flourishing. um, I'm wondering, do you think that your turn to Le Guin is as an example of someone like these figures who was, are you trying to sort of extract that kind of a lesson from her, in this kind of sense of trying to find that kind of way forward in a time in which there's all these crises of meaning and legitimacy?
Yeah, I think that she helps us here. And what's interesting to me about her capacity to do that is that, she's not Gramsci or Goldman, right? Like she's mostly living through periods, like she was very activated politically by the Vietnam War. She was very, she had views, but she wasn't particularly, um, she wasn't doing like building organizations of the left to transform things. And in many cases, I worry about my own impulse to read her for her political philosophy. There's a part where she frequently actually talks, when she mentions it at all, she talks about feeling irritated that people are trying to read her novels as treatises. Um, and and she says, I wonder, the people who do this, I wonder if they never ask themselves why, if I wanted to write a treatise, I instead wrote it as a novel. Um, and so she says the way to read my work is to read it as an expression of an idea. Um, and and I think there's something also here about, and this, we find this not only with Le Guin. I think science fiction writers are doing this all the time, right? Octavia Butler very famously said, when we're imagining the future, we're just imagining something that is not more of the same. Or Samuel Delany, right? He consistently has this refrain in his critical writing on science fiction and in his own science fiction that is like, science fiction is always in critical dialogue with the present, and so anytime we read it, it's doing that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Le Guin, because of how long she wrote for and how much she wrote, there's many cases. Science fiction writer Joe Walton says this, that there's so many cases where the world that we are living in science fictionally, in terms of the conversation that's happening about the present, in science fiction as it imagines the future, that conversation is, um, shaped and made possible by things that Le Guin wrote that now sometimes feel outdated, or we can see their flaws, and she could see their flaws often, not always. And we can talk about some of the problems in the Dispossessed, actually, that we want to, I think, really think with. But um, but the conversation that allows the critique couldn't have happened without her writing the initial, um, transformative work, that moved us into a different conversation. So there's something there, I think, about, her being someone who, and I don't have an account of this, I don't know, maybe we don't need one, of like why was she able to be so politically acute? Like, I normally am really suspicious of people who write really beautiful political work but don't actually do anything. Um, so I don't feel that way about her for some reason.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a I think a good observation. Um, my second question about this, and this is more sort of your sort of personal attraction to this, I wonder whether you ever made any sense about this. You say that you come to Le Guin in some sense with, um, or at least at the time that you were beginning this deep dive with a kind of a Buddhist sensibility. Do you think that you were attracted to Ursula's work and her insights in politics because of the way in which she blends Taoism? And
Yeah.
perhaps many of her solutions are kinds of Taoist considerations about how to react to conflict and disagreement in society. I wonder if that aspect of her work spoke to you in any kind of way.
Yeah, this is something I have only recently been thinking about, and I would never have said it before. Um, but yeah, she has this bit. So she did a translation of the Tao Te Ching, or like a sort of rendering, she would call it, because she didn't read Chinese. Um, and she says Taoists and anarchists make good conversation mates. Like it's a useful. And I think one of the fundamental things in her most Taoist books. So she has this book, The Lathe of Heaven, which is really engaging with Taoism as and in the mode of like, what does it mean to shape the world that we then live in? Like, what does it mean in that novel, The Lathe of Heaven? There's someone whose dreams shape the world. They make reality, have always been that way. Um, and then she has this other book, The Telling, which is very explicitly a reckoning with the Cultural Revolution and with the attempted, and nearly successful eradication of Taoist practice in a certain, so so she's really like there. She is very explicitly political, and there's certain ways that what's happening in the Dispossessed are also engaging it. Um, and in her other very overtly anarchist novel, Always Coming novel, it's not the right word. It's an ethnography of the future, Always Coming Home. Um, so I think her Taoism, it's just really interesting. Like, so for me, one of the core things that I'm still, in struggle. I'm still in struggle with Buddhism. And one of my core sites of struggle is precisely around hierarchy, which also I have in relation to activist work and anarchist work, where um, in order to have lineage, right? You asked me initially, like, who do I like those relations of who we think with, who trains us, who shapes us. Those are part of our relations of responsibility, and knowing that about each other gives us some footing, right? Like, who are you connected to? Who are you responsible to? Um, so in Buddhism, that's like your lineage, like who trained you, who could you go back, who could someone go back to and call you into responsibility. Um, but as soon as you have that, you have fixed hierarchies and you have power, and then you pretty much always, in every tradition I've found, you have abuse of power. So there's some way that in Taoism, the sort of resistance to fixed hierarchies and to even having that approach to lineage, it changes something and it maybe short circuits some of the will to hierarchical power. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that it feels feasible to go toward her work is political, but I think also part of it, yeah, is this emotional sense of collectivity that is horizontal and that has a relationship with history, but that is more able to do without fixed hierarchies.
Yeah,
But who
that's
knows? I'm not a
fascinating.
Taoist, so yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to think about there. I like that. Thank you. I mean, well, let's get into this then a little bit about your work on the dispossessed. You say that you've been trying to kind of distill
Mm.
a kind of perspective, Odonian anarchism from the dispossessed. So, what do you think Le Guin's work can tell us about anarchism? And in particularly, right, in a kind of engaged sort of way, what insights do her anarchist ideas have for the sort of political projects that sort of face us in the world today, socially, politically, right, environmentally? So, what does Odonian anarchism have to do to help us understand, comprehend, move forward in the world today with all the projects that we might want to get underway?
Yeah. Um, so I'll start this kind of along on the side of the dispossessed. You've probably, I'm sure, read the story, "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas." Um, and so this story, for people that haven't read it, they could just pause this and go read it. It's widely available on the internet. Um,
Yeah, we'll put a link to it.
yeah, okay, good. So "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas" tells the story of a beautiful city, amazing, a festival, riveting people, fascinating conversations, good drugs, interesting music. Um, and there's a part in the story where Le Guin has a nice train system. She says, "Oh, are you bored? Do you doubt this? Do you have a hard time believing that this is a society of people who are as complicated and interesting as you?" And this is, of course, a question that I think anyone who thinks about a different world asks, right? Like, when we read, if people have read William Morris's News from Nowhere, which is a utopian novel where the main character says, "I just wish I could see it. I just wish I could see the world that I'm trying to," like he's coming home from a kind of annoying political meeting, and it's so relatable. It's like, 100 years ago, but you're just like, I feel you. Um, and then the utopia that he sees is super boring, as they so often are. Um, and so Le Guin says, "Is this utopia boring to you? Well, then imagine this." And she tells this um, inside story she says, "Turns out all of this beauty is reliant on the immiseration of this child who's being kept in a broom closet and not spoken to, fed the bare minimum." And she says, "Now do you believe this society? If I give you this um, utilitarian claim that all of this goodness rests on the immiseration of this child." Um, So this is a story that I've taught, I've read a lot of times, and I've always thought of it as just that, either a trolley problem story where it's like kill the one to save the many, or as in N.K. Jemisin has a story response to it called "The Ones Who Stay and Fight." I've been like, why not stay and fight and liberate the kid? There's a lot of meta and fan fiction about coming out of this story. And in one place, Le Guin writes about the anarchist theorist who is the origin point for the dispossessed and for Anarres, that Odo, um, the theorist, that she characterizes her as one of the ones who walked away from Omelas. And this always bothered me because I never saw the ones who walk away from Omelas as an anarchist story at all. It it seemed to me like a thought experiment, you know. And then last summer, I I read this Tumblr post by a user named Seeking Ferret, who is a friend of a friend in fandom. I don't know him personally, but I now am completely convinced about his analysis. He says that he sees the child in the broom closet in the ones who walk away from Omelas as a kind of Watson-like figure, right? So a meta commentary that says, when I tell you this story, notice that you cannot believe it unless the goodness of a society rests on the immiseration of someone. Um, what would it be to be able to imagine a possible world of goodness, of flourishing, of complex, interesting life that doesn't rest on someone's misery? What happens if we refused that aspect of the equation? And so now I feel, reading um, Le Guin's anarchism, that one of the things that it's all doing is really trying to help us imagine the possibility of a society that does not presuppose that misery and exploitation and horror is necessary to people's happiness. So, um, thinking then about Odo as one of the ones who walked away from Omelas is this nested narrative where in the Dispossessed, she's offered to us as someone who was able to imagine this society beyond the stricture of the idea that some people have to suffer in order for other people to live well.
Yeah, I like this idea because it makes Omelas much more sort of interesting as a story. Rather, I mean, it works so well as an allegory that can be useful for getting us to think about relationships of oppression and what it takes. For me, what's always been interesting. This is a side note, but what's always been interesting. There's a line in there where when she presents the case of the child. She talks about the different ways in which people react to the knowledge, and that how many are willing to just simply rationalize it on this kind of utilitarian kind of way, and sort of she just talks about the sort of psychological processes of justifying it that go in. I always thought that was really interesting as a making that story as an allegory. But now this is really interesting because it sort of really gets us to think in a much more imaginative way, that this is pushing us to really to challenge our kind of allegorical powers and get us to think about, like, what is a totally different kind of society like? Because we
Yeah,
know that our society is she's directly critiquing sort of making a realist critique about the way that these power relationships work. But now it's actually asking us to envision much more strongly what a different kind of world would be like. And then
yeah,
that's what the Dispossessed tries to do with the question about Anarres.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's fascinating. Yeah, I think I like that
Right?
very much. Yeah.
Yeah,
But so what does the Dispossessed tell us about anarchism, right? So part of it is that, she spent a long time trying to sort of understand like how anarchism would work and how it would sort of develop. And this is the kind of thing that, when I teach anarchism in political philosophy classes, my students are always like, how does this work?
yeah,
And on a day-to-day basis. And so this was her answer. This is how it would work. And so are there are there lessons about how
yeah,
the society is arranged that we should take from
yeah,
this in order to understand how anarchism is a lived philosophy?
definitely. Yeah. So I think one of the things that's great about The Dispossessed is that it's 175 years into the society of, you've established an anarchist society on a moon. Um, and what happens? And anyone who's done any political organizing will just recognize all of the failure modes of anarchist organizing, right? So like the person who is a propertarian of the mind and is stealing people's work, the person who's just like such a pill to work with, the person who is like how hierarchies get rebuilt precisely at the moments that people are saying, oh, there's no hierarchies here. So it really, the subtitle of the book is An Ambiguous Utopia. And I think one of the things that's beautiful about it is that it's really highlighting some of the ways that nothing is ever done. Um, so I guess we could sort of go in two different directions. I could sort of lay out for you what I think are characteristics of Le Guin's anarchism and the way that I think she is formulating a specific form of anarchist communism. Or we could talk more about just sort of like cool things that the Dispossessed is doing that we could also think about and critique. Which do you want
Well,
to
I'd
do?
be I'd be curious about the first one. What is you mentioned that you're trying to distill this idea of Odonian anarchism. Like, what is that? Like, what do you think she's contributing to anarchist thinking that's unique and cool and helpful for us today?
Yeah. So many times Le Guin gives this definition of anarchism that it is against the idea of the state. So the authoritarian state, the state is always authoritarian. And for she does this in her description of the Dispossessed, right? She's like, this is Odonianism. She says Odonianism is anarchism. she says it's not the bomb in pocket stuff or libertarians, it's not that. It's based on cooperation, mutual aid, and solidarity. So this is like, she says this pretty soon after The Dispossessed comes out. 40 years later, she was coming to a conference in Santa Cruz, and she gave an interview with one of the local papers, and she repeats this definition almost verbatim, that it's about cooperation, mutual aid, and solidarity. So I think that we can typify some of the things that show up really consistently, both in the explicitly anarchist work of The Dispossessed, but also actually in many of these other places where her anarchism shows up. So in The Lathe of Heaven, in The Telling, maybe especially in Always Coming Home, which again, in one of her descriptions of it, she said, I'm always surprised that people don't read Always Coming Home as a much more political novel than The Dispossessed, because it really is my articulation of actually not a society that is in internal struggle with itself, which The Dispossessed is. The Dispossessed is in internal struggle with itself because it is artificially separated from the context of struggle that gave it birth. So it is, the anarchists have been moved to the moon, and the helical structure of the book is going back to the planet that they were exiled or self-exiled from, and taking responsibility for continuing to be in struggle, not just leaving to make a utopia somewhere else. So I think it does this kind of amazing thing. But it does really lay this out. So I think um, I'll just sort of say a little bit about each of those. Is that okay? So when Le Guin is talking about cooperation, both in The Dispossessed and then in some of these other places, she really has this kind of, I think, three ways that she's expressing what cooperation means. Um, and the first one is this idea of non-ownership. In The Dispossessed, this is consistently organized through the idea of you come with empty hands. All you have is what you're born with, which is yourself, and that's what you can offer. So the anti-capitalism of non-ownership is that there's nothing that is yours except what you can give. And the thing that you give is only manifest if it's possible for it to be received. So there's this quality of open-handedness. And then also under that sort of rubric of cooperation, she has this formation of what she calls amari, which is sort of like her version of a comrade. So to be amari is to be someone who is in a kind of relation of unfixed hierarchy, where you have an open hand, you offer and you receive. So it's like being siblings, right? I kind of want, I wish that on the left we could take up amari as our replacement for the term comrade. And then also under this rubric of cooperation, she has this very strong articulation of the idea that flourishing comes from sociability. So you remember that part when Shavik, the main character in The Dispossessed, is at a cocktail party on the planet of Uras, the propertarian planet.
Yeah.
And someone says to him, but society is the strongest, right? It's whoever wins is the strongest. And Shavik says, yes, yes. And in a sociable species, the strongest is the most sociable, which is the most ethical in human terms. So this idea of cooperation has this quality of like, our strength is in our sociability. And we are to the degree to which we are together. And this is very Kropotkin, we really see that. Which then really also takes this form in thinking about mutual aid, which I think is the sort of second key criteria of Le Guin's anarchism, definitely from Kropotkin also, but with more of a emphasis, I think, on the necessity of resisting or refusing charity models. So that in order to be able to give, we have to also take ourselves as someone who can receive. And that if we're really in relations of this, like horizontal relations of cooperation, the possibility of mutual aid relies on us not having the attitude that we are potent and someone else is beneficent, is receiving our beneficence, but instead that we receive care, we offer care. So it's not a charity model, right? It's a kind of a space where the only way that you can receive something also is in your open hand, right? Like you have to also receive in order to give. Um, so cooperation, mutual aid, I think. And also the sense of like an injury to one is an injury to all, right? I think it's also just sort of basic, like back to the Wobblies. But then maybe most interesting to me of her in her work, and maybe most new, I think, is the specific way that she thinks about solidarity, which I think is her third central term. And here, I really feel like she is profoundly interested in solidarity as fundamentally reliant on difference, deviance, proliferation, refusing sameness. So in anarchism, I think always we have this tension between sort of like individual uniqueness, do whatever you want, or be part of the social polity, be for the good of others. And Le Guin gives this very beautiful account of solidarity as having a social world in which our specificity, uniqueness, she says, the thing that we do best, and which is therefore the thing that we can best offer to the world, that what we are here for is to create the possibilities for everyone to be absolutely the weirdest version of themselves. Like that's what society is for. In The Dispossessed, she calls this the cellular function. So Shevik, the main character, he's really struggling with what it means to be, he's a theoretical physicist, and there's a famine, and it's not useful to do theoretical physics, right? And so there's a period of time where he goes and he just helps plant crops to try to keep people from starving. And then that time sort of eases, and it's like, should he keep doing theoretical physics, or should he do things that are more practical? There are these other figures in the book, one person who is a playwright, and it's sort of like, is that actually socially useful? Um, and a big like origin point for the book and for the conflict and the transformation in the society that's depicted there, for thinking about it as something where we could all walk away from Omelas, is Shevik recognizing being a theoretical physicist is his cellular function. It's the best of him. It's the thing that he can best offer. And therefore, his society should be the kind of society where he can do that to the best that he can. So this is a model of solidarity where we're not just trying to get everyone to be growing better, more nutritious food. That's really important. And everyone's got to sort of do their part in that. But that what society is for us to be able to become more specifically ourselves. And we're becoming more specifically ourselves in order to contribute to a society in which others can become more specifically themselves. And she thinks about that as solidarity.
That's fascinating. I love this. My question would be about this. So what you've been describing here, at least, is the development of a really kind of rich anarchist ethics way of being in the world. Do you think that this anarchist ethics has implications for, or in some sense, sort of conditions how we ought to envision, like the design of institutions, organizations, policies that we need in the world, given the kinds of uh, um, crises that we're facing? Like, how do we make sure that we think about these values in such a way that they don't become sort of like what Bookchin was criticizing, right? Lifestyle anarchism. Like, oh yeah, that's nice, have those kinds of values, but what we really need is, municipalism or something or other
Yeah.
to make this all. Like, has your work investigated the question of like what are the sort of like design implications of this
Yeah.
ethics, which is so rich?
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading Stafford Beers recently and sort of thinking about the infrastructure questions from sort of that tradition. I don't really know what I think about it. Um, so I can answer this in two different registers. One is just my like super philosophy register, where in my own work, um, not really with Le Guin, what I've been really focusing on and thinking about is this kind of imperfectionist ethics. So an ethics based on um, non-innocence, on implication. So this sense that the reason that we have standing to make political claims and to try to do things in the world is not because we're innocent, but because we're implicated. Um, so, so that's sort of one of my philosophical projects. And in that, I've been really finding my colleague Catherine Norlock, has this beautiful article called "Perpetual Struggle," which is a Stoic. She's doing a Stoic approach here, but it's really working with this sort of insight that despite things being overwhelming, nonetheless we can do our best, and we may not succeed in the world, that creating the world, but we're going to keep going. Um, the place that I see this formulating, or the place that I'm compelled and um, smitten, totally crushed out on Le Guin, is in her approach to thinking about process and ongoingness. So there's a part in The Dispossessed where Shevik, the main character, is talking with his partner Takvar, and and Takvar says something like, because she's an Odonian. She believes that you set off in a direction, but you don't intend to stop. You don't intend, you know that you're never going to end. Um, in my, uh, in my also academic work, I did a oral history project about AIDS activism in the Canadian context. And one of the things that struck me so strongly there, and that I've thought about a lot in my own organizing work, was how people would win or lose something, and they would just still go to the next meeting to think about what they were going to fight for next. So that whether they won or lost, it was just the terrain of struggle for the next thing. Um, in Le Guin's work, she has this attention to the idea that when we're building a society, it's got to be a society in permanent revolution. It has to change. And I went into a long nerd dive into Trotsky and Mao, which I'm not going to do right now. But this idea that we have to pay attention to process um, opens, I think, so much for us, right? Ethically. So if we really do think that there's not an end to struggle, and that that's a joy. One of my teachers when I was in grad school is Angela Davis, and she constantly talks about freedom being a constant struggle. And something that I think people really miss about hearing her say that is that for her, and I think for Le Guin, something being a constant struggle means that it's ongoing and that we take joy in the ongoingness of it. It means that it's alive, right? It's not dead. But then that also means we're not going to do things anymore where we say, I'm going to be okay with burning everyone out as long as we win this campaign. Or I'm going to burn these relationships to the ground because I'm never going to want to work with these people again. Like, if you really start organizing with the sense that you are going to try to work with these people forever, and where you even start really organizing with yourself as though you're going to refuse your own relations of domination, right? Like, what if you refuse to burn yourself out to accomplish some limited end? What if you think about, like, let's imagine as though we're going to continue? What changes, right? So ethically, I think what changes is we start to really pay attention to how we are with each other. In anarchism, of course, we call this prefiguration. And this means also, like, really, we have to stop being okay with having rapists and serial abusers in our spaces because they're useful in some way. In my activist work here, my collective, really, we think about this. We have a workshop and we're working on um, various other things about thinking about infrastructure as harm prevention. So, what does it look like for us to set up spaces in our organizing where we're going to really try to prevent people from getting burnt out? Or when we see, hey, this guy comes to every meeting and strikes up a conversation with these much younger activists, and then they end up dating. And then, like, what happens if we try to figure out, like, okay, why is that happening? What are we doing that could change that? Because we don't want to keep losing people, you know? So I think there's the philosophical part, but the practical part is like, what infrastructures are we setting up that predict either the possibility for continuing to struggle forever as a joy, or where we just like cycle through people and they drop like flies and we try to bring in some more people later.
Yeah, that's such important work. I'm actually I just finished reading this book by Scott Bransom called Practical Anarchism that came out 2022.
Yeah, it's
I don't
great.
know if you, yeah,
Yeah.
some really interesting thoughts and reflections that made me start to think. But one of the issues there that that they point out is thinking about how to move away from I think they call it the apocalyptic sort of view of time that's informs so much of our thinking about the revolution,
Yeah.
that this is a really sort of dangerous kind of framing of time for anarchist work because it sort of allows for all of these kinds of problems and creates like authoritarian tendencies like, oh,
Yeah.
we have to sort of organize in a certain kind of way hierarchically in order to accomplish the goals of the revolution, but that anarchism, Branson says, really requires us to think in a different kind of way about process and
Yeah.
about anarchy as an ongoing kind of everyday, already lived phenomenon or process in our everyday lives, and to sort of think about the ways in which we can manifest it in the cracks of moments of rebellion, right? And
Yeah.
so instead of thinking about that end time, we have to sort of look to see like when can we make a different kind of way of living manifest
Yeah.
itself or bloom at certain points, but it's never going to, there's never going to be a moment at which it's all okay. And trying to
Right.
work for that politically with all our institutions is something that's very dangerous and hurtful and harmful for individuals and for the goals and the values that anarchism represents. And so it's fascinating to hear like that you think that this is Odonianism,
I
right?
think
In
it's
this kind of way.
Odonianism. I mean, there's a part in The Lathe of Heaven where one of the characters says he's he's like being derogatory toward the idea that the ends justify the means. And he says, what if all we have is means, right? Um, but I think the thing that's useful about it is, yeah, all we have is means. Obviously, there's never an end, right? Death is the end. But the thing is, you still set out, right? You still set out in a direction, Takfur says in The Dispossessed. So you're never going to stop going, but you can go in better or worse directions. And so that's also why we really have to have like strategic and tactical conversations, like how would we tell if we're going in a good direction? How would we assess if we're winning? Like it comes
Yeah.
down to this really, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much we could talk about, I think, and there's so much still in your work that I'd want to speak about. But like all things, this must come to an end at some point. I did want to ask, though. I mean, I want more about this. So, like, what is this project that you're working on? Like, where are you hoping to bring all of these insights together? Is there a book project that's coming out of this, or
yeah,
what are you
yeah,
envisioning?
yeah. So I have over the last year, I've written this short book that right now is called "No Higher Purpose: Making Meaning in the Mess," and it's basically my attempt to say what Le Guin's anarchism is and why it's helpful for us politically right now. And it's specifically coming in with this kind of anarchist stream that connects with a lineage of Black existentialism and Black anarchism. Um, so, like, what happens if there's no God and there's no particular human nature and there's no necessary social space, social coding that predicts what we have to do? Like, what happens if we really don't have a higher purpose that's given to us by someone else? Instead, all we have are the like earthy, homely, smaller purposes that we make together. Um, so the book has, a, yeah, it has a chapter about feeling like uh, adrift on the waves of the climate changed ocean, like what it means to think about agency and doing and making things when we're in this political moment of fascism rising globally and being subjected to things that we never, could never want, but some people really do. And like, ah, you know, ah. So it's this kind of like existential crisis moment, right? Like the world is ending. How can people be like this? Um, and then it's sort of like, what does Le Guin offer us? So there's a chapter about collectivity as a form of existential affirmation. There's a chapter about Odonianism. There's a chapter about process and the idea of means and ends. Yeah, there's one about fan fiction and what it means to tell stories, to narrate worlds that are beyond hierarchy. Um, and yeah, so I don't have a publisher yet, and I'm revising it to try to make it a little bit less like not totally just a philosophy nerd book, but instead something that people might want to read. But it's been such a delight to work on it, and it is the main thing that's making me feel a sense of political possibility right now, aside from all of the work that people are doing right in the world. Um, so I'm hoping that if assuming I finish it and that it comes out somewhere, it'll be useful.
That's excellent. So hopefully in the next couple of years or so, we can look forward to looking at that.
Yeah,
That will give us a great opportunity then to sort of continue this conversation and deepen in some of the stuff. I would love to talk to you about this because we didn't get to talk about the question about choice really
that's
and
true.
so forth. So,
Yeah.
but this might give us some opportunity to explore that a little bit more.
Well, let me just say these like last two sentences from Le Guin, right? So she has this definition of an anarchist. She says, an anarchist is one who, choosing, takes the
Yeah.
responsibility of a choice. And then elsewhere she says, but the choices of a social being are never made alone. So that, like, between those two phrases, I think we find so much. So yeah, let's talk about that in another couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Alexis, thank you so much for coming and sitting down to talk with me about this in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Dispossessed. There's so much richness here that remains still to be explored, but I have appreciated and learned so much from your work so far that I look forward to further conversations with this.
Thank you, Jose. It was really wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in and listening to us. If you have questions or comments or thoughts that you'd like to share about your experiences with the Dispossessed or Le Guin's anarchist outlook, please leave us a comment. Let us know what you're thinking. You can find us all over the internet and social media. You can find us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Threads. And you can also find us on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. But we appreciate your attention and we look forward to further conversations with all of you. Thank you, Alexis.